The screen flickered, casting a harsh blue light over the desk. Jessica stared at the bank balance. The number was red. It was a digital warning that screamed louder than any alarm. She refreshed the page, hoping for a calculation error, but the total remained unchanged. Rent had cleared. Utilities had been paid. The account was effectively empty. She leaned back, the chair groaning, in the absolute silence of the room. Outside, the city hummed with activity, but inside, the air felt stagnant and heavy. She picked up a stack of paper bills, sorted them by date, and realized there was nothing left for groceries. Not for the week, not for the month. She dropped the papers, the sound sharp against the quiet. The reality of the deficit settled into her chest. A cold, hard anchor. She looked at her laptop, the screen reflecting her own tired face. She did not have the luxury of waiting for the situation to fix itself. She reached out, pressed the power button, and watched the cursor blink against the dark background. She had to generate something from nothing. She opened a blank design file, her fingers hovering over the keys, and started to build. The first month brought 2 sales, 2 files sold to strangers. The notification pinged on her phone, a tiny metallic sound that felt like a breakthrough. She earned $40 in total. It was not enough to cover rent, but it was proof that someone, somewhere, valued her work. She shared the news over Sunday dinner, hoping for encouragement. Her mother set her fork down with a sharp clatter. Her brother leaned back, arms crossed. They spoke in short, clipped sentences. "Get a real job at the store," her brother said. "You are wasting hours on pixels that should be spent on a paycheck." Her friends echoed the sentiment, sending texts suggesting she stop before she lost more time. They saw a hobby failing. Jessica saw a foundation being laid. She cleared the dishes, ignored the notifications piling up on her screen, and returned to her desk. The house grew quiet as the others retreated to the living room. She sat alone in the dim light of the monitor. The doubt from the dinner table lingered, but she did not respond. She opened the design software again. She adjusted the layout, tightened the margins, and hit save. She chose to work while they chose to watch television. Jessica stopped clicking through design templates. The aesthetic appeal of her planners mattered less than their utility. She opened browser tabs filled with market data, industry reports, and competitor analysis. She spent hours tracing the flow of information on her screen, identifying where her layouts failed to solve real problems. Her workspace became a grid of notes and screen captures. She stopped asking if the colors looked good and started asking if the structure saved time. Every night, while the house slept, she worked in the glow of the monitor. She tracked how often a user interacted with a specific column. She measured the time it took to input a single entry. She stripped away the decorative elements that served no purpose. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a new, rhythmic precision. She was not just building a file anymore. She was engineering a tool for productivity. The frustration of the previous weeks began to dissipate, replaced by the mechanical satisfaction of constant refinement. She adjusted a line, updated a formula, and watched the efficiency score climb. She ignored the clock until the sky outside her window turned gray. She was no longer creating for herself. She was building an engine for others to use. Jessica began sending emails. She reached out to every customer who had purchased a file, asking a single question: "Where does your current process break?" She spent her afternoons refreshing her inbox, watching for responses. Most were silent, but one stood out. A small business owner wrote back with a detailed list of frustrations. He struggled to track inventory across multiple platforms, losing hours to manual data entry. Jessica read the email 3 times. She realized her planners were too broad, too generic. She sat up straight, pushed aside her current drafts, and pulled up a blank spreadsheet. She started mapping the business owner's logic. She calculated the steps required to automate his inventory counts. She stripped away all her previous assumptions about what a planner should look like. She built a prototype designed specifically to hold his data. When she sent the file back, her hands hovered over the keyboard. Minutes later, a reply arrived. "This saved my entire afternoon." Jessica stared at the screen. The feedback wasn't just a compliment. It was a blueprint. She stopped designing for the masses and started building tools for specific, measurable pain. The momentum was tangible now, a steady thrum of progress that finally outweighed the doubt. Every dollar Jessica earned vanished back into the business within 24 hours. She bypassed groceries to pay for professional software licenses. She skipped meals to afford the hourly rate of a freelancer she hired to handle data entry. Her bank account remained perpetually close to zero, a high-wire act of faith. She lived in a cycle of constant, calculated risk. She spent her days managing the freelancer and her nights optimizing the back end of her tools. Her apartment grew colder, but her server capacity expanded. Then, the balance shifted again. A message blinked onto her screen from a high-volume client. It was not a request for a standard file, but an urgent demand for a custom, multi-layered tracking system that required weeks of logic building in a fraction of the time. The client offered a fee that could solve all her financial problems, but the technical requirements were brutal. It was a massive, complex, and unforgiving challenge. Jessica stared at the project scope, her cursor blinking in the silence of her room. She knew she could not decline without losing the biggest lead of her career. She took a breath, cleared her desk, and began the work. The pressure was no longer just about survival. It was about proving her system could scale under fire. The work started at midnight. Jessica opened the file, her mind locked onto the complex architecture required for the tracking system. The first 3 hours passed in a blur of logic gates and syntax errors. She ignored the ache in her wrists. She ignored the hunger gnawing at her stomach. By 3 o'clock, the screen brightness felt like a physical weight on her eyes. She stood up, paced the length of her kitchen, and splashed cold water on her face. Her reflection was pale, but her hands were steady when she returned to the chair. The project demanded a level of precision she had never tested before. One broken line of code would collapse the entire system. She navigated the spreadsheet, debugging every cell, tracing every dependency, and rewriting formulas until they functioned with perfect, seamless speed. Her breathing slowed to match the rhythm of her keystrokes. Silence filled the apartment, broken only by the sharp, steady tap of the keyboard. At 5 in the morning, the final calculation returned a perfect result. She hit save. She leaned back, the chair groaning under her shifting weight, and watched the sky outside her window begin to bleed from black into a pale, bruised purple. The project was complete. Jessica hit send at 6 in the morning. She closed the laptop, walked to her bed, and slept for 4 hours. When she woke, the screen was alight with a single notification. The client had reviewed the file. A short, 5-word message confirmed the system worked perfectly. Then, the inbox began to chime. First 1, then 2, then 5 more emails arrived in rapid succession. They were not just inquiries. They were direct requests from 5 different business owners, each referencing the custom tracking system she had built. The revenue figures on her dashboard updated in real time. Where she had once measured her success in double digits, the balance now climbed into the thousands. The dizzying speed of the numbers caught her off guard. She refreshed the page, expecting a glitch, but the total remained. It was a breakthrough. The market had responded. She was no longer just a designer working in isolation. She was the architect of a system that businesses were actively seeking out. She sat at her desk, watched the notification count climb, and realized the threshold of survival had been crossed. The work she had done in the dark had finally pulled her into the light of a sustainable, scaling enterprise. Success brought a new, sharper pressure. Jessica stopped looking at her bank balance as a fund for groceries and started treating it as a tool for leverage. She hired a freelancer to handle the repetitive data entry that clogged her afternoons. She upgraded to software that automated her file delivery. Every dollar that entered her account was immediately funneled back into the infrastructure of the business. She did not buy a new desk. She did not upgrade her living space. She watched the margins tighten, then widen. She began moving the excess surplus into dividend stocks, treating each share like a silent partner. She spent her weekends charting the trajectory of her growth. On her monitor, the line representing her sales began to arc upward, while the line of her reinvestments tracked alongside it in a tight, ascending corridor. The two forces locked together. It was no longer just about the energy she put into the keyboard. It was about the capital working for her in the background. She tracked the compound interest as it flickered into existence, a small but undeniable weight of momentum. The system was no longer just running. It was gaining mass. She watched the curves rise, a visual testament to the power of patience over impulse. 3 years later, the environment had shifted entirely. Jessica sat in a high-rise office, the glass panes reflecting the city's sprawl far below. The silence of the room was heavy, interrupted only by the soft hum of the climate control. She pulled a printed balance sheet from the mahogany desk and laid it flat. The figures were precise, stark, and final. A net worth of over $1 million stared back at her from the paper. She traced the digits with her index finger, the texture of the ink sharp under her touch. The memory of her old desk at home surfaced, the dim light, the cramped surface, and the screen showing a bank balance highlighted in red. That number had been a cage. This number was a foundation. She adjusted her position in the chair, the leather creaking under the movement. She looked at the city lights beginning to flicker on as the sun dipped behind the horizon. The weight of the progression was absolute. She was no longer tracking files or managing small-scale referrals. She was looking at the summit of the climb she had started in a moment of financial desperation. The scale of the difference was not just in the currency, it was in the total command of her own trajectory. A young entrepreneur sat across from her, his pen poised over a notebook, waiting for the secret formula. He expected a list of viral trends or marketing hacks. Jessica closed her laptop, the sound of the hinge sharp in the quiet office, and leaned forward until her elbows rested on the desk. She looked at him, not with the arrogance of a victor, but with the steady gaze of someone who had survived the long haul. "I simply refused to quit when the progress was invisible," she said. The young man hesitated, his pen hovering, looking for a more complex answer that was not there. Jessica did not offer one. She stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass. Outside, the city pulsed with millions of lives, all moving at their own pace. She touched the cold surface of the window, watching the traffic flow like blood through the streets below. The girl who had once calculated the cost of groceries was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that the only currency that never devalued was the refusal to stop. She leaned her forehead against the glass, letting the city lights blur into a soft glow. The work was finished, but the lesson remained etched in the quiet of the room.